Grandma L. A short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. I first moved on to the Carswell estate when I was 11. By the time I was 12, I knew who Grandma L was. In the past, the word witch would have been shouted and screamed, screeched and howled by an angry mob, pointing with accusing fingers toward the hut on the edge of town or the hovel that rested just beyond the tree line. Now, though, when such monsters lurk not on the fringes but amongst us, it is in the muted tones of rumour and hearsay that such wicked stories are shared. It was not with a shout, but with a whisper, muttered in a school cloakroom one damp afternoon, that I first heard about the witch on the hill. It was 5 years later that I actually met her. Grandma L was the matriarch of one of the biggest and, I don't think it would be unfair to say, most notorious families on the Carswell estate. Everyone knew a Clark. If you weren't related to, married to, or employed by one or another member of the family, then you clearly weren't from these parts. The older members of the family, L's 7 sons, were all in some way involved in the building trade and indeed any job, from plastering to tiling, extensions to patios, that wasn't paid for by the council, or which, more likely, was never even broached with the council at all, would have some member of the Clark family involved. On a close-knit estate, they were the wool. As united as they were numerous, you would never cross one for fear of the rest, and in particular, of L. As with every great terror of children, there were few details and even fewer specifics to L's story. So infrequently was she actually seen that some, including myself, had questioned on more than one occasion whether she existed at all. It was clear, however, that there was something about this woman, as even within the older generations a degree of reverence was paid to this motherly and yet somehow malevolent figure. In some stories, she was a Robin Hood-like character who sent stockings of fell-off-the-back-of-a-lorry gifts to needy families at Christmas, or slipped pleasingly heavy brown envelopes through the letterboxes of those recently made redundant. In other stories, she dealt out justice of a supernatural kind. According to my classmates, old Winston, who was often seen around the precinct with his 2 withered hands, became like that after he had slapped one of L's granddaughters during an argument. On another occasion, so they said, a boy who had graffitied the outside wall of her house was badly burnt a few days later in a freak accident involving a burst water pipe. The boy, who was scarred for life, or defaced if you will, spent the day after he was discharged from hospital voluntarily scrubbing the spray paint from that wall. The house to which that wall belonged was one of a row of 3 council-built bungalows that sat alone at the top of Marston's Hill. Many years earlier, a large supermarket chain had been granted permission to build in the area around the hill. The council, catching the scent of the money that would be generated by such a development, had moved and compensated those families whose houses were in the way of the planned site, and the supermarket had bought out those who owned their houses outright. These properties were then demolished to clear the way for the buildings, parking, and supplementary infrastructure that a large supermarket would require. All the houses, that is, except for L's. L's bungalow, the 3rd in the row, was the only one of the 3 that was occupied at the time, the tenants of the other 2 having left the properties boarded up many years before. L refused to move. Initially, representatives from the supermarket had reasoned that she was holding out for a better deal, and believed that by being the last man standing, she would receive a considerable lump sum for giving up her home. Indeed, they attempted to entice her to move with a succession of extremely generous offers, all of which were flatly, but politely, refused. Eventually, so the story goes, the supermarket appealed to the local MP for the area, John Ardyke. Rumoured, and later proven, to be taking large sums of money under the table to foreground the company's interests, Ardyke became increasingly impatient with L's stoutness and, as a result, became more openly hostile in his approach to solving the impasse. As soon as he took over management of the issue, L began to receive threatening letters warning of legal action or worse. These letters were always returned to the postman the following day, each in a small glass bottle filled with ash. Eventually, Ardyke's difficulties with these letters extended to having them delivered in the first place. As a succession of Royal Mail employees openly refused to deliver them through the letterbox, or even to enter the garden, he was rumoured to have personally intervened to have them sacked. The one brave soul who did eventually post what amounted to a thinly veiled threat was given a letter in return to post on L's behalf. Which specific decision-maker at the supermarket this letter was intended for, or what it contained, we will never know. 2 weeks later, however, after spending millions demolishing houses in preparation for building, and no doubt contributing quite a sum to Ardyke's personal coffers, the company seemingly lost interest, whilst Ardyke, embarrassed and furious, lamented the loss of bribes to come and seethed. The 3 bungalows on the hill were left as the only survivors of the cull, untouched, intact, and alone. A few days later, 2 council workers, clearly directed from above, posted a sign covered in plastic to the door of L's house. The sign, intended to ease a bruised ego, read simply, "You'll be sorry, witch." Whether L and her family didn't see the sign or considered it a badge of honour is unclear. It remained there for nearly 2 years, until one day she calmly walked out of the house and unceremoniously set it alight. All of which meant that the first time I was forced to climb Marston's Hill and found myself standing by the gate of L's garden with the seemingly insane intention of actually entering the house itself, I was somewhat less than excited by the prospect. My reason for making this ridiculous errand was simple. It was my job. Sort of. In those days, people didn't buy their milk at the supermarket. Instead, the milk would be delivered to their doorstep by a milkman, and indeed, for many on the Carswell estate, it still is. This milkman would drive around in the early hours of each morning with his crates from the dairy, and would drop off the requested number of pints, ready for the customer to splash on their cornflakes that morning. To help him in this task, our milkman, Tom, would usually have 3 or 4 lads from the local area whom he would employ to make the deliveries according to a set schedule each morning. For a while, when I was 16, I was one of these lads. Seeking to raise a few pounds, which would then inevitably be spent over the coming weekend, I had asked Tom about taking the job at the start of the school year. After a month or 2, during which thankfully I was never called upon to leave milk at the end of L's garden, Tom usually taking that responsibility himself, I realised that the early mornings were adversely affecting my schoolwork. I reluctantly informed Tom that I would no longer be able to continue delivering the milk. To my relief, he suggested that I switch to collecting the money on a Thursday and Friday afternoon. This job, which involved similar pay to the deliveries, required me to simply visit the same houses that I had delivered to in the mornings and collect payment for the milk according to a list that Tom would compile in a small notebook. The same houses, that is, except for one. In most cases, when collecting payment for the deliveries, the transaction would be completed on the doorstep. All too often you would stand in the drizzle, pacing from one foot to the other in an attempt to stay warm, whilst the client, comfortably dry in their porch or hallway, fished around in a purse for the exact change. Other times, such as at the local old people's home, the collection took a little longer and was actually more like a short visit, during which you would catch up with the client, ask after their children, and listen to them as they told the same joke as the previous week and complained about the weather. Though it wasn't technically in the job description, this type of thing was actively encouraged by Tom, who at times would highlight a certain individual and tell you, "Just spend a bit of time with this chap tonight, his dog's just died." Or, "Stop and have a brew with this old girl this week, she sounded a bit lonely last week." It was a part of the job that the people visited seemed to really appreciate, and, though it seems a strange thing for a 16-year-old to want to do with his evenings, something I really enjoyed. You honestly don't know who's living in your community until you have a cup of tea with them. Some of them were fascinating. There was Mr. Bedson, the old man who had fought in World War II and had a passion for photography. Every week he'd regale me with tales of his times in the army, and on one occasion even allowed me into the dark room he had set up in his back bedroom to look at some of his old snaps. There was Mrs. Floyd, the great-grandmother who surprised me on one visit by rolling up her sleeve to reveal an arm and shoulder entirely covered in tattoos. There was old Louis, who spoke in a Glaswegian accent so thick it was virtually indecipherable, despite the fact that he had never even been to Scotland. Jan, the Norwegian gardener, whom I would always find in his garden with his sleeves rolled up, no matter how cold it was, and, of course, most fascinating of all, there was Elle. In the case of the house on the hill, it was to be one of these visits. Elle, Tom informed me, was not only getting on in years, but had a wooden leg, which made it somewhat difficult for her to move around. It would therefore be necessary for me to not only knock, but actually go inside the house and converse. It's strange, but I still remember exactly what the order I was to collect from Elle's place was. Payment for 2 pints of semi-skimmed and a bottle of orange juice. I also remember that the first time I was ever called upon to knock on her door, I seriously contemplated running away. I couldn't help it. I remember staring at the order and wondering whether, instead of visiting the house, I could simply add the money to the collected funds myself out of my own pocket, and pretend to have collected it. The cash would be the same, the tick would go in the book. Who'd ever know? The obvious flaw in this plan was that I had already spent the previous week's wages, and therefore had no money to put into the collection even if I wanted to. Not to mention what would happen if Elle enquired as to why she was suddenly receiving free milk. Still, I was petrified. My mind flashed back to all those autumnal nights when a group of us would dare each other just to enter the garden, let alone touch, or, God forbid, open the door. Now, only a few years later, and still more of a child than I would ever have openly admitted, I stood in the fading twilight, alone on the hill, with what, if the reports were to be believed, was a monster. Even the house itself seemed to squat and watch with malicious intent. The row of 3 bungalows were terraced, so they looked like one single long block, sharing a roof, but with separate gardens and front doors, divided from each other by interior walls. Whilst Elle's house had flowers and hanging baskets blooming outside, the other 2 dwellings, connected by bricks and mortar to hers, were boarded up and dilapidated. The gardens, if they could even be called that, were overgrown tangles of weeds and waist-high grass. The overall impression reminded me, sickeningly, of my great-aunt's face after she had suffered a stroke, one half leaning and palsied, whilst the other retained the light and glow that it always had. The houses to the right seemed to have atrophied, withered on the vine as if tainted and polluted by some poison. I stood at the gate for a full minute. Standing there, with nothing but the whispering breeze through overgrown grass for company, I thought again of the whispers of children and all the heavy dread that comes with the name witch. And yet there was something else in me, a sense of duty to Tom and a stubborn adolescent refusal to remain a child. I gritted my teeth, muttered something to myself about not being stupid and there being no such thing as witches, and rapped on the door. At first there was no reply. I waited, noticing in a way that I never normally would that it was getting darker. As the shadows pooled and bled into one another, they seemed to me to be conspiring together to paint over the light and block my exit. At that moment the door swung open. Upon entering the house, 2 things struck me in quick succession. The first was the enormity of the place. Even a few steps inside revealed the outside of the house to be a cunning subterfuge. The walls, separating one terraced house from the other, had been knocked through, undoubtedly by one of Elle's many sons. Whilst from the outside it appeared that only one property was occupied, inside it was revealed that all 3 had been knocked together. Being bungalows, the result of these modifications was to create one immensely long room. Aside from its size, however, the room itself was not markedly different to those I had seen in other residence homes, though, notably, there was no bed. All of this I took in an instant, my attention more immediately captured by the second thing that I saw. In the middle of the room, a few feet from an ancient-looking rocking chair, was what appeared at first glance to be a large pile of dark fabric. It took me a few seconds to notice the frail white hand protruding from the mass. The next few moments were a blur. One thing I can say for certain, however, is that in that moment all superstition vanished from my mind. This was real-world fear, white-hot, immediate, and tangible. I bent down, pulled back the fabric which had ridden up over Elle's head, and felt for a pulse. It was a horrible way to first see someone. Her head, covered in short curls of snow-white hair, seemed so tiny and fragile. Skeletally thin, with a milky pallor, my thoughts flashed immediately to my great-aunt in her last days, how all I'd wanted to do was swaddle her up and protect her. As it was, I did swaddle Elle, having partially remembered some first-aid class from school and the importance of keeping people warm. I took the heavy blanket from the chair and, laying it over her, brought my mouth close to her ear. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm getting help, but I'll be back." With Elle's house being so isolated, running to a neighbour wasn't an option. Instead, I ran down Marston's Hill, my legs freewheeling beneath me so that I almost stumbled several times. When I reached the bottom, I bundled into the phone box and dialed 999. The operators were clearly local, aware of the rumours and seasoned victims of prank calls relating to this address. It took 3 attempts for them to take me seriously. Having been assured that an ambulance was on its way, I then sprinted back to the top of the hill that earlier I had gingerly dragged myself up, and waited by Elle's crumpled form until the ambulance arrived. When I had seen that she had been loaded into the ambulance and shared with the drivers the names and addresses of the sons that I knew, I diligently traipsed, shaken and breathless, back down Marston's Hill, and finished my round. When I finally met back up with Tom, an hour later than expected, I climbed into the passenger seat of the milk float and explained what had happened. Tom listened patiently and put one of his massive paws on my shoulder. "You did good tonight, lad," he pronounced, and handed me my wages, with an extra £10. "That's for being a hero," he said, and winked. That wasn't the only gift I received that week. The next morning, I was woken by a loud knocking at the door of a parent's house. Having spent the extra money and my wages underage drinking the previous evening, I was hoping on behalf of my hangover that the real owners of the house would be available to answer it. Unfortunately, a second, more insistent knock confirmed that they had gone out. Scrabbling downstairs and wondering why this person was so averse to the concept of doorbells, I woozily opened the door. My stomach, already delicate, somersaulted. It was Stephen Clark, eldest of Elle's sons, and a man with a reputation almost as mythic as hers. For one horrible moment, I considered the possibility that I could somehow be held responsible for what had happened to Elle. Suddenly, standing there in my boxer shorts with t-shirt on inside out, I felt incredibly vulnerable. Hi, Stephen. How's your mam?" I probed tentatively. Stephen's expression never changed. "Just came to say thanks for what you did for my mam," he said, ignoring my question completely, but also offering some relief from the sense of immediate peril. "This is for you, from Elle," he went on. He handed me a small rectangular box, of the type you might expect perfume or expensive cigars to be packaged in. With that, he turned and walked away. As he reached the gate and without turning round, he shouted, "Watch what you're doing with that, lad. It's strong stuff." At first, I was understandably nervous about opening the package. From Stephen's words, I had a slight suspicion that it might be some kind of intoxicant. The box was made of light pine wood. When I finally worked up the courage to open it at the hinge, I found that the inside was lined with satin. Lying upon this satin, like the body in an expensive-looking coffin, was something which looked to me like the sticks of charcoal we would use to sketch in art class. This charcoal stick was around 7 inches long and had a chalky texture to the touch. There was no note, no explanation, and I had no clue. I placed the gift carefully back into its box and returned, gratefully, to bed. With the exception of Tom, whom I had spoken to on the day itself, I told no one about my experience at Elle's house, not because of fear or any sense of duty, but because I didn't really think it was anyone else's business. Unfortunately, some people clearly didn't share my outlook. At the start of my next shift, after handing me the notebook with the list of orders, Tom paused and looked at me sternly. "You went inside Elle's house last week, didn't you, lad?" I nodded, yes. "Thought so. I hear she'd had the whole row knocked through into one big house. Is that right?" Again, I nodded. Tom's lips thinned as he pressed them together tightly, mulling over his next sentence and weighing his words carefully. "Well, it's a bit different now. You'll see what I mean when you get there. I dropped off the milk this morning because I was asked to by one of her lads, but I'm not sure there'll be anyone there today to pay for it. Go up and knock, but if nobody's there, you come straight out, you hear me?" Usually a perpetually jolly fellow, it was strange to see Tom so agitated. "What's going on?" I asked bluntly. Tom opened the passenger door to let me out. One of the ambulance drivers told Ardyke about the house. I didn't have to climb Marston's Hill to see the consequences of this leak. I could see it from the bottom. The previous week there had been 3 bungalows at the top of the hill. Now there was 1. Having gotten wind of the arrangement at Elle's home, John Ardyke MP had sent workers to the property, acting on the assumption that the Clarks owned only the first house in the row and displaying the sort of petulant cruelty one usually associates with spoilt children. Ardyke made good on his threats to make Elle regret her stubbornness. Over the course of the next 3 days, the 2 properties not owned by the Clarks were razed to the ground. Whilst Elle lay recovering in hospital from a minor fall, Ardyke's minions, reportedly hired from another borough as local workers refused to participate, set about systematically demolishing the adjoining properties. Every brick, every wire, every pipe and plug were extracted and removed. The books, ornaments, and sundry personal possessions found in the properties were declared to have no known owner, and were either thrown in a skip or unceremoniously piled up in the front garden and burnt. A further consequence of this demolition was the impact it had on the remaining house. Having been knocked through to join the other properties, Elle's home now had no internal wall, meaning what remained on the hill was a 3-sided structure with a roof that extended into nothing. One whole side was left open to the elements. Seeing this from the bottom of the hill, I did wonder whether it was worth making the climb at all. It was December in the north of England, and with snow on the ground, the remaining shell of the house had been rendered uninhabitable. Perhaps, I supposed, someone was collecting the milk from here and taking it to wherever Elle was staying now. Maybe someone would be waiting at the top to meet me. So, reluctantly, I turned up the collar of my jacket against the sleet and marched up the hill. The first time I encountered Elle, crumpled and vulnerable on the floor, there was nothing remotely intimidating about her. She was instead the very picture of human frailty. The second time I met her, she was the very picture of a witch. Just as before, the door, clearly loose on its hinges, had opened of its own accord. I stepped inside and, within seconds, regretted it. There, seated in the same rocking chair I saw earlier, her back to the open space where a wall should have been, was Elle. Sleet fell in sidelong slashes onto her, coating her hair and the thick black dress she wore with glimmering splinters of ice. Her face, which only a week before had looked as fragile as porcelain, was hard and angular, as if carved from wood. She sat rigidly upright, her muscles taut and fingernails digging into the arms of the chair. Her eyes, which were of a cold Atlantic blue like the numb, dead eyes of a fish, seemed to have frozen into a venomous, spiteful hate. At first, the vision was enough to strike me dumb and force me to take a few retreating steps, but relying on the part of me that was becoming more man than boy, I hardened my resolve and spoke. "Bloody hell, Elle, you'll catch your death. Come on, let's get you up to your Stevens. You can't stay—" "Sit down, boy," she interrupted decisively, in a voice deeper and louder than anything I'd have imagined could have emerged from her frame. Without a second thought, I sat on a nearby stool. On her lap she held a wooden box, similar to the one I had been given, but much larger. Without saying a word, she opened the box to reveal a pile of the same charcoal sticks I had received. Before I had a chance to ask what they were for, she leaned forward in her chair and fixed her eyes directly on mine. "My grandmother gave me these," she said, sliding an outstretched finger delicately along the length of each stick in turn. "These are the bones of Vinegar Tom, blackened by fire. Write the name of an enemy with these, and they'll not cross you again. My mother wrote names, and her mother before her." She paused here, and slowly and deliberately looked me up and down. She blinked a few times, as if pondering some great truth. Then she slowly closed the lid. For a second, her face softened, and she smiled. She said at last, nodding to herself as if satisfied. "I thought as much. Bury yours, lad. You'll not have the heart to use them." With that, she took out a small leather coin purse and, leaning towards me, handed me the exact payment in change for the milk. As she did, she took hold of my hand. Her fingers were icy. "Thank you," she said. "I'll pray for you." With that, she turned away, and I took my cue to leave. That was the last time I ever saw Elle. The next day, I threw the charcoal bone, still in its box, into the lake nearby to my house. I hope that it stays there. Whether she did pray for me, I don't know, and I can honestly say it has never concerned me as much as the thought of who she might be praying to. For the details of my encounters with Elle, you only have my word. My dealings with her ended that day. There are, however, a number of other details that the reader needs to know in order for me to consider my story complete. I present them to you as a simple list of verifiable facts. Make of them what you will. If you search Elizabeth Clark Witch in Google, the results will detail an incident from 1644 in which Matthew Hopkins, known as the Witch-finder General, oversaw the hanging of the confessed witch Elizabeth Clark in Essex, southern England. In the days before her execution, Clark, who had a wooden leg and whose mother, Elizabeth Clark the Elder, had also been hanged as a witch, confessed under torture to having kept and suckled at her breast several familiars. These demons, or imps, were in the guise of household pets. Their names included Pyewacket, Peck in the Crown, and a dog named Vinegar Tom. The first image result you will find is a woodcut showing Hopkins, Clark, and these familiars. A copy of that same woodcut hung on the wall in Elle's house. A week after I last saw Elle, a story appeared in the local newspaper about John Ardyke MP. He had apparently been the victim of a practical joke, as a group of painters and decorators he had hired to touch up his living room and kitchen had instead painted every surface in a pitch-black charcoal before abandoning the job completely. Ardyke, who was said to be furious, had threatened legal action. Anyone able to find this incident in the local press of the time should also be able to easily locate the report from the same paper 2 weeks later, featuring the same house. The story is about a fire. Whilst Ardyke and his family were unharmed in the blaze that destroyed his home, tragedy did befall the family a month later when the widely respected MP fell ill with a rare neurological disorder. This disorder, which presents similar symptoms to those experienced in sickle cell, attacks the nervous system, exciting the pain receptors to the extent that modern anesthetics are almost entirely ineffective. John Ardyke died a week later, in agony. The lake into which I threw Elle's gift also featured in the paper that week due to a strange incident in which all of the fish, seemingly suffocated by some pollutant, floated up to the surface dead. Local businesses were investigated in connection with suspected pollution, but no conclusive evidence was ever found. Finally, it is worth noting that the late Mr. Ardyke's wife, Pamela, and his now grown-up daughter, Angela, are not on speaking terms. The root of the animosity between the two is that Mrs. Ardyke, a superstitious woman by all accounts, has publicly accused her daughter of being partly responsible for her husband's death. Her contention, it seems, is that his illness was in some way linked to a drawing the then 6-year-old Angela drew of her father. This drawing, upon which the word Daddy was crudely written in a child's looping hand, was drawn with a stick of charcoal, given to the young Angela by someone she described at the time as a nice old lady. This has been Grandma L, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.